Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 174. We are so glad that you've joined us. If you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, please remember to do so because it really helps us spread messages like this one to others. Thank you. Last week in our study of the Bible that Jesus used, we ended by summarizing the first 9 books of the Jewish Bible, showing that each of them is historical. They record events that actually happened, and they are written in straightforward prose or literal, straightforward language. That means they're not symbolic. The first 5 books make up the first section of the Hebrew Bible, which is called the Torah. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The next 4 books are written in historical prose, but they form the beginning of the second section of the Hebrew Bible. The prophets, the Nevi'im, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And both Samuel and Kings are 2 books in our Bible, but 1 in the Hebrew Bible. Now this brings us to the book of Jeremiah, the first prophetical book in the second section. According to Dr. Peter Gentry, in the Tanakh, that's today's Jewish Bible, Isaiah actually comes first, but we'll look at that in a minute. Both of these books, either Isaiah or Jeremiah, whichever one comes first, gives the name to the second section called the prophets, the Nevi'im. And they also act as a commentary explaining the first 9 historical books that came before them. Jeremiah comes first because it was the longest of the prophets. Its genre is mostly historical narrative, not poetry. When you read Jeremiah, you'll find that it's quite different than the book of Isaiah. But it contains 33,002 words, according to the website overviewbible.com. Jeremiah prophesied around 600 BC. He lived during the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. So that means he lived during the end of the book of Kings. It's my belief that he wrote Kings, but I can't prove that. But the book of Jeremiah certainly explains why Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in the book of Kings, so it serves as a commentary, as we've been explaining. Jeremiah is followed by Ezekiel because it's the second longest of the prophets. It has 29,918 words. Ezekiel was a contemporary of Jeremiah, but whereas Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem during the Babylonian captivity, Ezekiel was deported and ministered to Israel in Babylon. He too explains when and why the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, and he wrote largely in historical narrative style like Jeremiah. However, his writings contain a lot of symbology of actions that you still need to interpret, not literally. And that's where some of these genres begin to play with us a little bit. And so you have to be aware of that. And the more familiar you get with that, the easier it is. Ezekiel is followed by the book of Isaiah, which is largely poetical. According to Dr. Peter Gentry, this is the oldest arrangement of the Jewish Bible. However, the modern-day Tanakh puts Isaiah first in the prophet section. Isaiah lived around 700 BC. He also prophesied about the Babylonians. Now, at the beginning of this year, I began doing multiple series on Sunday mornings about Isaiah, and you may want to go on our website and look at those because I give more detail about Isaiah in that series. Now, Isaiah is followed by the last book of the Nevi'im, or the prophets, and it's called the 12 Prophets. It's 1 book in the Hebrew Bible, but it's actually 12 in the Christian Bible. And Christians call these prophets the minor prophets, not because they're less important than the other prophets, but because they are shorter in length than the other prophetical writings. Hosea is poetry, and he ministered around the same time of Isaiah, around 755 to 715. Then you have Joel. His is mostly poetry, which we can't be sure when he ministered. Amos is mostly poetry, and he ministered during the time of Isaiah. Obadiah, he's mostly poetry, and he ministered around 586 BC. Jonah is mostly prose, straightforward narrative. He served sometime between 780 BC and 612. Micah is mostly poetry, and he served at the end of Isaiah's ministry as well. So you can see there's a lot of prophets all at the same time. Nahum follows Micah in the Hebrew Bible, and his book is mostly poetry, and he prophesied sometime before 612 BC, which is the fall of Nineveh. Then there's Habakkuk. He's mostly poetry. He wrote sometime around 600 BC. Then there's Zephaniah. He's mostly poetry, and he did his work sometime around 630 BC. Then there's Haggai. Haggai is mostly prose. It has some mixture there, but it's straightforward narrative. And he prophesied around 520 BC. Then there's Zechariah. He's a mixture of prose and poetry with a twist that's like Ezekiel. And he was a contemporary of Haggai sometime around 520 BC. And finally, there's Malachi. He's mostly poetry. And he was chronologically the last prophet in both the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. And he served around 450 BC. Now, honestly, I do not know why these 12 prophets are arranged in this order. It's not something that I have come across in my reading and study, but it is something I will keep an eye out for in my future reading so that I can address maybe what the theories are on why these books are arranged in the way that they are. So the third final section of the Hebrew Bible, after the Torah and the prophets, the Nevi'im, is the Ketuvim, and that's the writings. The first book is the book of Psalms, which is the Jewish hymn book. Now, this is according to the research done by Peter Gentry. You got to understand there's about 70 different ways that manuscripts are organized that scholars can look at. And a good argument for Dr. Peter Gentry's arrangement of the Old Testament, that the Psalms came, because he actually refers to the Psalms as the first book in the section of the writings, the Ketuvim. We find that in Luke chapter 24, somewhere around verse 44. Jonathan will have that up on the screen. So that really kind of lends us to that Dr. Gentry's view is the oldest and probably the most accurate. But the Psalms, its history, it was written sometime between 1000 BC and 500 BC. And so it spans a good section of time. This is followed by the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is a book of truisms and principles, and they were written sometime between 950 and 720 BC. Job comes next. We're not sure when it was written, but it covers a time period before that of Abraham, and it addresses the question of suffering and the goodness of God. This order is totally different than the Christian Bible, as you can see, for in the Christian Bible, Job precedes the Psalms. So I understand this can get a little confusing, but what I'm trying to establish here in this lesson is that our Christian Bible has a different arrangement because it's arranged according to Septuagint. The Jewish Bible is arranged, the Tanakh is arranged more like the Bible that Jesus used, but there's still some discrepancies on exactly what that form was. But the basic form of it is pretty certain today. Now, Job is followed by the Song of Solomon. It's written sometime between 970 and 930 BC by Solomon, and it celebrates love and marriage. Ruth follows and is a short book which tells the story of a Moabite woman named Ruth who becomes King David's great-grandmother. She lived sometime between 1100 and 1200 BC. This is followed by Lamentations, and it records the sorrow experienced by the nation of Israel during the Babylonian captivity in 586 BC. It's a very sad book. Ecclesiastes follows this, and it was written by Solomon in the 9th century BC, and it records Solomon's midlife crisis. There's no other way to say it. The guy is depressed. He's having a midlife crisis. He goes out and gets a motorcycle, a perm, and a gold necklace. It's written in straight prose, however, so it's pretty straightforward, but it covers some deep human subjects. Esther follows, and it is written in prose, and it took place sometime around 480 BC, and records how Queen Esther saved the Jewish nation from destruction during the reign of the Persians. Daniel follows Esther and contains historical prose and prophecy. If we look at the Hebrew Bible from the literary rational point of view, which we've explained in this series, is that the Old Testament books in the Hebrew Bible are arranged according to literary principles and not chronologically. It makes sense to put Daniel here. Daniel covers a whole span, and he has history and he has prophecy, so it forms a nice bridge. Daniel is followed by Ezra and Nehemiah, and this takes place after the exiled Israel returned from Babylon sometime around 539 BC. It's written in prose, it's straight historical narrative, it's not symbolic language. Now, the final book in the Jewish Bible is Chronicles, which records the history of Israel from Adam to the Babylonian captivity. So what we see, as we sum this up, why this is important is, regardless of who's right, whether the Tanakh has their historical order between Isaiah and Jeremiah, those couple discrepancies, or whether Peter Gentry's research is the one that's totally correct, both agree on the general organization of the Jewish Bible. And why this is important is because whether it's the Tanakh or the way Dr. Peter Gentry has found in his research, it is true that the first 9 books of the Hebrew Bible and the last 4 books of the Hebrew Bible are historical narrative. These prophetical books that are found in the middle between the first 9 historical books and the last 4 historical books serve as a commentary to explain why history unfolded for Israel the way it did. This is so important for us, and this is the reason why we did this series. We've got to begin to look at the Old Testament prophets as giving the divine perspective, the reason from God's point of view of why history has unfolded the way it did for the Jewish people. And when we begin to understand the Old Testament from both the historical and the commentary point of view provided by God, we begin to see history and God's role in it in a much different place, and we get a clear picture of what's happened and what happened that led to the events of the birth of Christ and the crucifixion and the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ and the spread of the gospel from that time until ours. Now, next week, we're beginning a new series called I'm Only Human. It's going to be a look at what the Bible means when it says that human beings were made in the image of God. Now, if this lesson's helped you, please share it with a friend. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or check out our Sunday morning live podcast on either app or Spotify. I hope to see you next week.